UK, and a very warm welcome to all the people who are joining us from around the world for our latest webinar from the Kohima Educational Trust. It's fabulous to see so many people signing up for these, and I'm just doing a little bit of an introduction before we make sure that everyone's on, and we'll start then formally with Sylvia May, our Chief Executive, giving a short introduction. But it's fantastic that we can have so many people along tonight to hear a discussion about a really intriguing subject. In the history of war, there are lots and lots of particular specialist areas that are just entirely forgotten by history, largely because no one wrote it up at the time. And the remembrance of those stories is stuck in the heads of those who were there and perhaps their families. And the story of V-Force is one of those. So it'll be really good being able to unwrap that together tonight. And hopefully as the months and the years go by, we can think about perhaps publishing a book on it and getting a little bit more, anchoring the subject in publication a bit more if we can. So we'll just wait a little bit longer for people to join. And here we are, Sylvia May.
Well, hello everyone again, and a big welcome to you all. Welcome back to those of you who have been faithful followers of our Kohima Educational Trust online programs this year. And I know that many of you tonight have tuned in regularly, but a big welcome also to all those new tonight, in particular, the families of those and descendants of those who fought with V-Force. And I know many of you have registered from around the world, so welcome all. V-Force was set up by General Sir Archibald Wavell in April 1942, when the Japanese drove the British Army from Burma and seemed likely then to invade India at that time. He ordered the creation of a guerrilla organisation, which was to operate along the frontier between India and Burma, which of course included passing through Nagaland. To take us through these events this evening, it is my pleasure once more to introduce Dr. Robert Lyman, an eminent military historian and author of many books, including Slim, Master of War, Japan's Last Bid for Victory, which is just out in paperback, and his new book, A War of Empires, Japan, India, Burma and Britain, 1941 to 1945, will be published on November the 11th. We will have time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. Please feel free to utilise the Q&A button found at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Lyman will pick up these at the end of his talk. Alternatively, please use the chat button and we will try and answer as many questions as we can. Now, over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much indeed, Sylvia, and welcome again to this conversation that we're going to have tonight. I'm going to take you through the story of V-Force. And I just want to say a few things right at the outset. The first is that even to me, although I've been around the subject for a while, V-Force is opaque. It's opaque because there's been very little secondary publication on it. It's opaque because although the archives in the National Archives in Kew seem substantial, there's a lot of the usual stuff that a historian needs, accounts, diaries, memoirs, that just don't exist. There are a few very good memoirs, published memoirs. And of course, we have veterans' families who have diaries and so on, but there's not a huge corpus of material. So I'm going to take you through a relatively high-level account of the story of V-Force, introduced by Sylvia tonight, but it will be relatively cursory in places. I'm going to try and pack a lot in. So if I appear to be racing, there's a reason for it. I just need to start by saying that the Statesman newspaper in Delhi ran a story in 1945 in which it said, in the fullness of time, they, the newspaper, would publish the account of the gallantry of these lonely fighters who hit back with pluck unsurpassed in the dark days. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. No one has managed to pull the story of V-Force together in a comprehensive way so far. I know that our friend Harry Fessett is working hard on this subject at the moment. He's mining very fruitfully the archives in Kew, and I'm very grateful to Harry for the material he's given me for this talk and for other things as well. So thank you, Harry. I'm entirely dependent on you in some respects for this. One of the first people who did write the story of V-Force in 1945 was a young Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Graham, who happened to be, of course, Sylvia's father. And he wrote in, if I can sort myself out, just give me a moment. He wrote in 1945 that V-Force was a military adventure. Not all such are sound military projects. And he asked the question, did V-Force in fact contribute substantially to the defeat of the Japanese in Burma, or was it merely a romantic but ineffectual idea which now makes good history? Well, we'll try and make a judgment about that as we progress tonight. The story has to begin with the Assam Rifles, which went back to the KET levies, which were established in 1835, and they were a paramilitary force across Assam and in the Naga Hills and across to Manipur, effectively a paramilitary organization keeping the peace, enabling security to be established between and among the disparate villages in the Naga Hills. And those who have heard the story of Panksha will have already been introduced to this remarkable body of men, most of whom were recruited locally in the region. But when V-Force was established, it was established around the framework of the Assam Rifles. So effectively trained soldiers, men who knew the country and the terrain and the people. We just need to very quickly remind ourselves that in December 1941, the Japanese began the invasion of Southeast Asia. And by May 1942, they had pushed the British out of Burma into Manipur. And you can see the capital of Assam there in the green part of the map, which represents India. We need to remind ourselves that the Japanese, when they invaded Burma, only really intended in the first instance to secure Rangoon, because it was the point at which the Burma Road began. They were so successful in the first stage of their advance that they decided to continue and very quickly overran the whole of Burma. Well, that gave them a number of problems. The first was that, in effect, by the time the Burma Corps had crossed the Chindwin into Manipur and had made its weary way back into Imphal, the Japanese themselves were exhausted. And although they looked at Manipur in 1942 with some longing, and in fact had prepared a plan to invade India in 1942, known as Operation Z, those plans didn't actually go anywhere. The Japanese were too stretched and too exhausted to do anything other than to sit on what they had captured and consolidated those gains across Burma. But of course, that exhaustion and Japanese strategic intent wasn't known to the British. And as Sylvia told us at the beginning, Wavell, who was the commander-in-chief India, decided that a number of things needed to be done in case the Japanese kept on coming. The Japanese invasion of Burma had been so quick and so slick and so effective and so shocking that it seemed logical to him and to many other people sitting in Delhi that the Japanese could just carry on going. What the Japanese didn't know is that all that Wavell had at the time was a British battalion in Manipur, the Seaforth Highlanders, the only one battalion of British troops standing between the Japanese and the remainder of India. Of course, no one in India had ever planned to mount a detailed defense of the eastern regions against Burma. It had never been considered that Burma would fall. He needed troops, of course, to be able to defend against the Japanese. The border was about 1,000 miles long from Arakan all the way up into the upper reaches of the Brahmaputra Valley. We'll show you a map in a moment, but he had no troops to actually do anything about it. So his initial idea was based on the assumption that the Japanese would keep on coming into India to establish a force of guerrillas, a little bit like Dad's army. That's probably the best way to see it. local men, local volunteers based around the Assam Rifles who would behave as guerrillas, primarily in an intelligence fashion to start with, but later on perhaps moving to aggressive and offensive patrols and ambushes against the Japanese occupiers. This indeed, well, of course, was tribal territory. And if the tribesmen agreed to join such a force, this could be very helpful eyes and ears for a British government and an Indian army that was probably in the Brahmaputra Valley or even on the other side of the Brahmaputra in the region of Guwahati. The plan that was established, the first idea, was called Plan 5 in Roman numerals. And the force that was established, and we know this from Colonel Graham's report, was called V-Force. You will see if you search the subject online or in libraries, it's often considered that this was village force, and that's not the case. It was from Plan number 5, and Plan number 5 can be found in the National Archives in Kew today. That plan didn't really last long, but before we explain what happened, a man called Brigadier Felix Williams, a very experienced Indian Army officer who had spent most of his career on the Northwest frontier, was given responsibility for pulling this idea or putting this idea into practice. And he was given quite a lot of money, about £100,000. He was promised 6,000 rifles from the armory in India. And he was told to essentially get on his bike, get into the hills and start pulling a V-Force together around the structure that already existed in the Assam Rifles. He very quickly realized that whilst he had lots of money, that money couldn't buy anything because the things that he needed didn't exist. So quite a lot of early work was spent in commissioning factories around Calcutta to get the material necessary to sustain a military force in the mountains. And of course, what didn't turn up were his rifles. Well, of course, he had a long experience of the Northwest frontier. He knew that the authorities in that region had seized and captured over many years large numbers of homemade rifles. So he made his way up to the Northwest frontier, persuaded the governor to give him access to these. They put them on a train and brought them all the way back to Assam and to the mountains. His task was to hold the border for 6 months. And during that 6 months, hopefully the army in India, the Eastern Army, would be sufficiently galvanized to be able to put up a reasonable resistance to any Japanese egress across the border. He was a very effectual leader, Felix Williams, and I would absolutely love to be able to find out more about him and whether he kept a diary or if members of his family have kept photographs and letters and so on. He's a key figure in the early days of the creation of V-Force. He set up 3 training schools. You can see them on the map. One right up in the Sadaya track. Sorry, I've gone and there we are, way up here, right at the top of the Brahmaputra. One in Kohima and the other at Haflong. I've told you about his unconventional thinking and collecting the rifles. Well, in the very short space of time between April 1942 and July 1942, it became very clear that the Japanese weren't going to undertake an immediate follow-up into Manipur and into Assam, and therefore the hills were relatively safe. V-Force very quickly got itself going, quite remarkably so, and within weeks, organized groups of V-Force members, mainly tribesmen, Kuki and Naga tribesmen, in particular around Imphal and Kohima, were escorting refugees, both from the Burma Army, the First Burma Army, and also civilian refugees from Burma into Manipur and Assam. And they very quickly set up a number of what were then to become watch and ward patrol bases along the Chindwin. And it's quite remarkable, most of these patrol bases remained there until 1944 and did exceptional work. A number of them were lost in 1944 to the Japanese invasion, but this was all established by July. And even in July, the reports are very clear that patrols began being made across the Chindwin into Japanese-held territory. And the aim now with V-Force was to start consolidating the structure and to deny the hills, Manipur and Assam, by which I mean the Naga Hills to north of Manipur, from the Japanese. And we know now that the Japanese, very soon after the invasion of India, began launching long-range reconnaissance patrols into the hills, very few of which were detected. Actually, I would say, I don't think any, I've come across no record of any that were detected. And yet we do know from the Japanese records that quite a number of Japanese patrols were undertaken into the hills, because they mapped out the approaches and plans for Operation Hugo, which was to fall on India in May 1944. Well, I also need to say at this stage that V-Force, over the time of its life, exhibited itself in many forms. So we've already seen a change in the idea of V-Force from April 1942 to May 1942, or July 1942 rather. In 1942, we can say that it was a watch and award operation. It was galvanizing local resistance to the potential threat of the Japanese, stopping the Japanese from coming across the border, and also starting to garner or gather information on the eastern bank of the Chindwin, and more of that later. In 1943, we saw V-Force changing itself into a much more aggressive intelligence gathering organization, not only in the hills, not only in Manipur and the Naga Hills, but of course over the Chindwin as well, into Burma proper. Quite a considerable number of long-range patrols, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and also a number of ambushes and counter-offensive or counter-patrol patrols against the Japanese as well. In 1944, with Operation Hugo, this is the Japanese invasion of India, we saw its transformation as well. It was very much in the early days of the operation, providing intelligence, direct battlefield intelligence to commanders on the ground, and in a number of cases, as in Kohima, taking part in the battle itself. And then again in 1945, at the end of 1944, December 1944, and on into 1945, it transformed itself again and was involved heavily, merged with another organization called Z-Force, and was involved in the reconquest of Burma. So it had many different lives, this extraordinary organization. I've taken this photograph from Ursula Graham Bower's wonderful book. One of her scouts, and we'll come to her in a moment. There were originally 6 V-Force area commands, which you can see on the map. The first one way in the top, there is some confusion around the numbering. There were 6 commands, but as time went by, some of them were separated out, and there was never formally a number 6, which is a little bit loopy, but there we are. Number 1 up in the Sadaya tracks around Lido, number 2 in Kohima, number 3 in Manipur, number 4 in the Chin Hills, and it's worth, we'll spend a bit of time looking at this. Look at the Chin Hills, it's exclusively in Burma. These were the people who were really right at the front of the Japanese attempts to subjugate the hills. And in 1942, it was a bit touch and go as to whether the Chin people would support the British, who had now formally left Burma, and throw in their lot with the Japanese, or vice versa. And then behind them, in what is now today Mizoram, was the Lashai Hills, and south of them as well, the Lashai Hills as well, now Mizoram, number 5 and number 8, V-Force commands, and in Arakan itself, number 7. Now, I've gone and broken all of these out so we can spend time looking at them in more detail, but I am concerned about time. The initial structure, this is a wonderful photograph of Ursula Graham Bower and a number of her Nagas. The initial structure was based, yes, around the Assam Rifles, but command was given to locally based officers, most of whom were pre-war civilians who lived in the hills, planters and so on, teachers, civil administrators. Each each command had a commander, a second in command, an adjutant, quartermaster, and medical officer. So very much a military structure, a military organization. And they were blistered onto, attached to, associated with the Assam Rifles. I just need to make this point that the Assam Rifles weren't V-Force. and V-Force wasn't the Assam Rifles. V-Force had its own organization, its own command structure, but the Assam Rifles were given responsibilities. They were under command of V-Force. The Assam Rifles also agreed to provide extra troops for training. One of the great lessons in 1942 was the need for jungle training for all forces, paramilitary or otherwise, and the 2nd Battalion of the Assam Rifles was made responsible for delivering that training in those 3 training areas I described. I make the point here very quickly with Ursula Graham Bower's, the man who was to become her husband, Tim Betts, and this is a wonderful photograph of their wedding at the end of the war. It's worth just reading this out. The reason I've put this up is because the news of the establishment of V-Force attracted a number of what I would describe as military adventurers from across India who wanted to see a bit of action or believe they could contribute significantly to this type of operation, and frankly didn't want to spend their lives overseeing baggage trains or administrative areas in India. And Tim Betts was one of these, and he turned up and insisted on a job, got it, and then made himself scarce from the military authority. So that when they came looking to him, he was out hunting the Japanese. This is fabulous. Miss Ursula Violet Graham Bower, MBE, known as the Queen of the Nagas, was married in Shillong to Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Nicholson Betts, 2nd Punjab Regiment attached to V-Force. During 1943 and 44, Miss Graham Bower, living in a rough basha 2 days' march from the nearest township, organized Naga tribesmen against the Japs, establishing a chain of observation posts, which gave the 14th Army one of its most valuable intelligence services. There we are. That's a fabulous photograph from the Bombay Chronicle. The V-Force commanders, well, I've mentioned Brigadier Felix Williams. He was replaced in 1943 by another extraordinary soldier, Brigadier Marindin. The area commanders, just give you an idea, a tea planter, Assam Police, Assam Rifles, E.D. Murray, Moat Murray, very famous name there, and so on. This photograph I have on the right-hand side of the C-47 coming in to drop supplies was sent to me amongst a great batch of photographs by a wonderful American correspondent who was there in the time in an observation post in the hills immediately to the east of Lido, attached to a V-Force post, which is quite remarkable. I only remembered in the last week that I had these photographs, and they are a remarkable reminder. There's a lot of other ones I can't show today. Maybe one day we'll do a session on them. How did V-Force work? Well, this is from Google Earth, and it shows the Naga Hills with the Chindwin quite prominent on the right-hand side, and Kohima in the middle on the left. The number 2 command was based in Kohima, and essentially it had a number of forward bases. And I think number 2 had 3 forward bases right up to the Chindwin, and their job was to do the watch and ward in 1942, increasingly to gather intelligence gathering patrols, a little bit of aircraft warning. This was giving by radio warning of the approach of Japanese aircraft. Actually, it was a very important task in 1943-44. If along the Chindwin, a Japanese aircraft could be seen coming on a particular track, that information would be radioed through to Kohima to give time for 1943, the Hurricanes to get airborne to provide counter-air patrols. Also collecting down to air crew. Those of you who know the Panksha story will recognize the importance of that from 1943 onwards, also patrolling across the Chindwin, but also on the interior lines between the forward bases and Kohima, continuing to recruit, training local tribesmen, and doing what we would now call keeping the army in the public eye. So ensuring that the local Naga villages in this case were aware of the government's activity on their behalf to prevent any hostile action by the Japanese. There are a number of early problems. I won't dwell on this, but essentially, this was a problem not just for V-Force, but for the entire army. There wasn't enough equipment, there weren't enough weapons, there weren't enough uniforms, and so on. And of course, the Naga Hills at the time really lived on a barter economy. So an enormous amount of stuff was required to replace money, and that needed to be acquired as well. So Felix Williams in the early days had an enormous logistics headache on his hands, just getting the stuff into the hills to be able to pay his tribespeople with. Now, very quickly, let's just go through each of the 6 commands. Lido Command, there were 4 platoons of the Assam Rifles up there in the Sadia tracks. It's actually forward of the tracks in the hills to the Paktoa Ranges to the east of Chapua. This was important because this was where the Americans were beginning their massive buildup of airfields to establish the hump airlift. From early 1943, the responsibility of V-Force came under the Northern Combat Area Command, which is commanded by Vinegar Joe Stilwell. And a significant responsibility in these hills was to support the activity of the aircraft, to provide early warning of approaching Japanese aircraft, and also to provide support for downed air crew. These photographs were also taken by my American correspondent, Vince Olivero, who was there for most of 1943. Then we had Kohima, which was spoken about. There were 6 platoons along the frontier, essentially with Burma and in the hills. The main task was to screen the Chinwin from any crossings that the Japanese might take. A number of patrols were sent into Burma at the time. And most of the casualties from the Japanese advance in 1944 occurred in the Kohima region. One of the most important men in Kohima, those of you who know the story will recognize the story of Charles Porzi, one of the most remarkable men that Britain has ever sent into these hills, amongst a real panoply of remarkable men. Charles Porzi became an honorary member of V-Force because he knew the Nagas across the region, and he was able to recommend men who would make good V-Force scouts. And those who didn't make the cut, nevertheless, were supporters of V-Force. And we know from his records, he spent a lot of time in 1942-43 walking the whole of the territory, essentially recruiting and showing the face of the government to the Nagas and all of the remote villages right up to the Chindwin. And one of the reasons why the Allies were so successful, the Indian and the British armies in Kohima, as many of you will know, in 1944, was because of the loyalty of the Nagas, who, to a large extent, rallied behind this remarkable man, Charles Porzi. I don't want you to get the idea that this was all patrolling and Saturday and Sunday afternoon activity. There was some very, very significant engagements by V-Force in the early days in 1943, so well before the Japanese invasion in 1944. And one of them is the remarkable Battle of Manpower. And I'll just talk about this. I've got it on the screen for those of you who can't see it. I'll just describe it very quickly. A V-Force patrol base with a radio overlooking the Chinwin at a place called Manpower was attacked by about a battalion of Japanese troops in December. In a surprise attack at 3:30 in the morning on the V-Force post at Manpower, the enemy quickly made a gap in the perimeter, and 4 Japanese made for the wireless station. They clearly wanted to be able to destroy it so that the British had no means of communicating back to Imphal. They already had the wireless in their hands when a Havildar and a rifleman killed all 4 with their kukris. The attack went on for 2 hours, during which time the Japanese continually attempted to rush the gap in the defenses, but were driven off with Bren gun fire and hand grenades. The V-Force commander, Lieutenant J.R. Godfrey, was wounded 3 times, but continued to take command until he received his 4th wound. This Jap force was finally driven off at daylight, with many killed and wounded at the cost of 2 killed and 11 wounded of the V-Force men. In V-Force history, a famous battle and actually a famous victory. And it's really quite remarkable if you read some of the citations for awards that were given to members of V-Force at the time, all available in the National Archives. many of which have been mined, probably all of which have been mined by Harry Fessett, and Harry Fessett hopefully is going to write all this up one day. One of them is Bindaman Ra. His citation is quite extraordinary, and we don't have time to go through it. We'll make this available on the website perhaps afterwards, but the story of the Battle of Manpower can be seen very directly through the bravery of this young soldier who received the Indian Order of Merit for his bravery. The third was Manipur. Manipur spent most of its time, the Manipur Command spent most of its time patrolling, undertaking deep patrols into Burma, and some of them were really quite extraordinary, and we'll touch on them in a moment. This was commanded by Moke Murray. Dymock Murray was his name, but he was nicknamed Moke, of the Gurkha Rifles. He had previously been the second in command of the Assam Rifles, so knew the terrain, knew the soldiers, and was spectacularly successful as a commander of this command. And there's his citation there. We need to move on and just touch on the work of Ursula Graham Bower. I think Catriona Childs is on the webinar tonight, so welcome to you. I'm very sorry I couldn't get to go with you to Lesong a few years ago with Hemant, but we'll do it again. We'll do it sometime in the future. Ursula was given responsibility for a watch and ward operation with her Zemi Nagas in the hills to the west of Imphal. And I need to say that in addition to Ursula Graham Bower's own book, there's an excellent book by Vicky Thomas published in about 2012 on the story, which is very accessible, very well written, and written with the support of the Betts family, and I do heartily recommend it. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to quickly move on. One of the interesting collaborations between V-Force and Manipur was with this man here, Ord Wingate, in 1943, and Operation Longcloth. Operation Longcloth was the first Chindit operation, an operation into Burma, where 3,000 men of the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade were sent to operate behind Japanese lines. And in order to be able to get into Burma, and in order to be able to make their way in the first few days and weeks of their operation, they needed intelligence, and all that intelligence came from V-Force. V-Force undertook early patrols to work out a route for the advancing troops. So Longcloth with Ord Wingate would not have been successful without V-Force at all. And this is a photograph of troops doing a river crossing during Operation Longcloth. Now, one of the most amazing Indian Army officers that I've ever come across is this man here, Bob Kathing. Bob was called Bob because British officers couldn't pronounce his Naga name. And there will be people on the audience tonight who will say it better than me, so I'll call him Bob. But Bob is a very big name in V-Force. Bob actually became Chief Minister of the Naga Hills or Nagaland and became the Indian ambassador to Burma long after the war. But he was an absolutely remarkable man. I'd love to be able to do a whole session on Bob Kathing sometime. But he was a very key part of V-Force. He was involved in a number of battles. He was recommended for an MBE, which he got, and 2 military crosses. One of the military crosses was downgraded to a mentioned dispatches, but he got his MC in 1945. What an extraordinary guy. Let me just read this out to you, because this really this is part of his MBE citation. This officer, the only Naga Emergency Commission officer, he was born in Ukrao, by the way, has for over a year, this was written in 1943, has for over a year without leave or rest continued to do most excellent and valued work in a forward area of this area of V-Force. The whole of last monsoon, he remained forward in most trying conditions, organizing his guerrillas and gaining much valuable information at a time when no regular troops were operating permanently. He also gave invaluable help to the withdrawing Chinese army. The information he gained has been confirmed. He has done very many useful and daring patrols and recce's, including all the way down to the Moore Lake area, from whence he brought back information of the Japanese positions. And this is a very interesting observation. This Indian Emergency Commission officer, by his trustfulness, his hard work, his unbounding energy and enthusiasm, has done much for the defense of India and is greatly deserving of recognition for his services to this country. absolutely fabulous story. And someone, I know an Indian officer has written this book, but it's unobtainable. I haven't managed to get my hand on it in a number of years. But this is a biography in the waiting. If there's anyone out there in the audience who'd like to do it, then there he is. I don't have time to go through this tonight. There are a number of fantastic citations to soldiers and V-Force for their work in Burma, and I just really highlight some of these patrols. This corporal was given the Indian Distinguished Service Medal, a remarkable achievement. Look at the length of those patrols. So 6 days, 80 miles, 8 days, 130 miles, another 6 days, 80 miles, another long patrol, 10 days across the Chinwan, 100 miles. This gives you some idea of the extent of the penetration of the Burmese border by V-Force in the long months leading up to the invasion of Burma of India in 1944. And much of the information, much of the hard intelligence that Slim had about what the Japanese were doing came from V-Force. Now, Slim also had the Indian version of Ultra, Bletchley Park, but that didn't give him the ground intelligence and told him what the Japanese were doing. He knew the Japanese were going to invade on the 15th of March because Ultra told him so, but he didn't know any of their plans. He didn't know where they were. He didn't know what units they were. This information came to him from V-Force. And there's another number of fantastic citations, which if you feel up to it, they're very, very easy to find on the search engine in the National Archives in London. Just type in V-Force and you'll find them all there. And you'll have a happy, very happy couple of hours reading the stories of these quite remarkable men. I mentioned the Chin Hills a little while ago. The Chin Hills were exclusively in Burma, and there were no Assam Rifles in the Chin Hills. Clearly the Assam Rifles were part of Assam, but there were other forces in the Chin Hills that V-Force attached itself to, and they coalesced and worked together. There was the Chin Hills Battalion, and there was another battalion raised in 1942 called the Western Chin Levies, commanded by a man who was called Francis Haswell, previously of the Burma Rifles, had quite an adventurous war in 1942 with the Burma Rifles as a major and was promoted to lieutenant colonel. He did a fantastic job pulling this battalion together, the Western Chin Levies in 1942. The very interesting thing about the Chins is that they worked very hard, almost from the beginning, to prevent Japanese ingress into the hills. So it wasn't primarily a intelligence-based operation from the beginning. Right from the start, the Chin Levies and the forces associated with the units in the Chin Hills were fighting the Japanese. And there are quite a number of extraordinary stories of small-scale engagements, but on a large number, small, but a lot of them, through 1943. The 5th and the 8th commands were in the Lushai Hills, now Mizoram. And because these were set back from the Chin Hills, they were effectively a watch and ward organization until 1943, when a formal offensive group of a formal group of troops was pulled together called the Lushai Brigade under Brigadier Marindin, who you'll remember was the commander of V-Force. And when he moved on to command the Lushai Brigade, the V-Force was handed over to the Deputy Colonel White, who actually died at the end of 1944. And they mounted lots and lots of patrols into Burma here, where my cursor is, if you can see it. So really to the east of the second little bubble denoting the Lushai Hills. And then the last, but by no means least, was Arakan. It became very clear to those of you who understand a little bit about the history of operations in Arakan that by 1944, effectively we were fighting two campaigns. We were fighting a northern campaign, by we I mean the British and the Indian Army, and a southern campaign along the Burmese littoral in Arakan. And Arakan was the responsibility of 15th Corps under General Christensen, and the northern area became exclusively in 1944-45 the 14th Army. So the 14th Army under Slim was separate in 44 and 45 to the 15th Corps in Arakan. And the work of V-Force clearly began together. It's quite part of the same organization, part of the same team, but they diverged in 1944 so that the V-Force organization really became part of the operations of 15 Corps. There's an absolutely fabulous book called Burmese Outpost, if you can get hold of a copy, by Anthony Irwin. Anthony Irwin was actually the son of General Noel Irwin, who was the first commander of Eastern Army in 1942. And you'll see in this drawing in the book by Anthony Irwin, Anthony is wearing the V-Force badge on his beret. Another very interesting drawing from the book is of a Mohammedan, a Muslim member of V-Force. And of course, you will all know from what you've heard of the Rohingyas that there is a Mohammedan or Muslim majority in the coastal littoral. These are all people who had over time moved down into Burma from Bengal, mainly fisherfolk. But right from the beginning, they threw their lot in with the British and operated in 1943 primarily as scouts and guides for regular force operations. In fact, also into 1944. And one of the really significant features of Arakan operations was the use of V-Force guides in the mountains. One of the real challenges, and there are a number of very good books on the subject, one of the challenges as you get further inland, there are clearly fewer Muslim fishermen, and you're dealing with different tribes people, many of whom would support the Baymar majority, the Burmese majority who are Buddhists, and therefore less inclined to support the British. So there was a dynamic there that needed to be dealt with. But if anyone, it's a fabulous book, Burmese Outpost, one of the great books of the Burma campaign. This is just an opportunity for me to show you a photograph of the very young Gordon Graham as a lieutenant there. But I put it up because in his report, he describes the operations of V-Force along the coast in 1943. And it's a hilarious read. And by the way, we're going to put Gordon Graham's report up on the website soon after this talk, so you can all read it for yourself. But I put in bold and yellow at the bottom this wonderful description that Gordon wrote of some of the operations supervised by people like Anthony Irwin. And I'll read it out. The Arakanese Mohammedans who worked as guerrillas on this front were totally different types from their counterparts in the Chin and the Lushai Hills. Many of them worked on tramp steamers. Colonel Donald, one of the leaders of the V-Force in Arakan, had nicknames for them all, such as Arizona Joe or Californian Bill. Asked to authorize an item of V-Force expenditure, the chief military accountant once inquired acidly who Sinbad the sailor was. I have always chuckled at that story. Alexander Donald, commander of number 6 V-Force in Arakan in 1943, was awarded an OBE, and his citation for that award is also in the National Archives and does demonstrate how highly the commanders of the conventional forces, in this case, 26th Indian Division, part of 15 Corps, thought of the work of V-Force. It really was quite remarkable in Arakan. So we come to that point of evaluation. In those early years, 1942 and 43, what did people think about it? I think about V-Force. And I've thought long and hard about this because two of the key users of this intelligence were quite dismissive of V-Force. Geoffrey Scoons, commander of 4 Corps in Manipur, was very he's very frustrated rather at the unheralded arrival of Japanese reinforcements at the height of the Battle of Imphal in mid-1944. And he says, incidentally, the arrival of this division or elements of it unheralded on this front is pretty poor chit for our higher intelligence organization, etc., etc. And General Douglas Gracie, quite a remarkable commander of the 20th Indian Infantry Division, who was first deployed at Moray and Tammo and up on the Shenham Saddle in early 1944, and whose troops held off the Japanese until ordered to withdraw to the Shenham Saddle, also said that he was not particularly impressed with the intelligence he received, and he took one of his best battalions, the 9th 12th Frontier Force Regiment, in order to be able to provide immediate battlefield intelligence of his own. But this evaluation needs to be seen in its context. V-Force was not seen as the sole source of intelligence for the 14th Army. The 14th Army needed to secure its own intelligence and had formal ways of doing that through regimental reconnaissance and so on. And the lack of intelligence from V-Force going directly to the divisions that were defending the Imphal pocket was not the fault of V-Force. V-Force, remember, was not primarily an intelligence organization designed to support conventional forces. It was an organization designed to hold together the tribespeople along this sensitive part of Eastern India, and to enable them to have confidence in the government and to be able to contribute to the defense of India and to operations when it was required. So this evaluation has sometimes been used to criticize V-Force, but I think it's unfounded. The Indian Army report that I referred to, written by Colonel Graham at the time, says V-Force became an integral and indispensable part of the defense of India's eastern frontier. And all the evidence that we can see from the reports, from the files that exist, from the citations, quite an extraordinary number of citations of V-Force soldiers, provide evidence for that. Apologies. Now, by the end of 1944, so the end of the big campaign in Manipur and Assam by General Mutakuchi Renya, Operation C, Operation Yugo, the March on Delhi, we saw V-Force and the whole of the 14th Army returning to the offensive. And as I said earlier on, this really saw V-Force enter a new phase of its operations, away from the watch and ward in 1942 and 43, away from long-range patrol and intelligence gathering activity, into actually quite considerable association with offensive operations in 1944 and 45. Another organization operating across the Chinwin called Z-Force, which we don't have time to go into, was amalgamated, or components of it were amalgamated with V-Force in 1944, and they worked together to be able to provide eyes and ears forward of the 14th Army. And there are a couple of things that I want to emphasize here. During the offensive operations by the 14th Army in 1945 in Burma, there were three very significant ones, all of which involved members of V-Force in one way, shape, or form. The first was in the Kaladan Valley with number 9 Command in Arakan. The Kaladan Valley was a remarkable set of operations. Actually, I won't describe it now because I'm going to do that in a moment. The Lushai Brigade, which I've mentioned, is commanded by Brigadier Marindin. All his experience in the V-Force, he brought with him, all his networks, everyone he knew was dragged into the new Lushai Brigade and the operations that they were given responsibility for at the end of 44 and start of 1945. And then the final thing we'll talk about today is Operation Character in the Karen Hills in eastern Burma, southeastern Burma, in March and April 1945. All of which involved men who had been recruited and trained and deployed as part of V-Force. The Lushai Brigade, first of all, were given responsibility for clearing a very significant valley. It's either called the Kabul Valley if you're heading down into it from the north, or the Mitha Valley if you're coming into it from the south. It starts at the Chinwin in the south and runs parallel. The Chinwin sort of moves up to the east and goes north again. And the Mitha Valley, or the Kabul Valley, very malarial part of the country, runs parallel to the Chinwin all the way up to Tamu. The responsibility of the Lushai Brigade was to clear the Kabul Valley and to be able to ensure that the Kabul Valley could not be a route by which the Japanese counterattacked the crossings, the 14th Army crossings of the Chinwin River at Kaliwa, opposite Tamu. So you can see the importance of clearing the area south. That responsibility was not given to conventional forces, it was given to the Lushai Brigade. We need to do another talk on the Lushai Brigade in due course, but their operations were spectacularly successful. Slim, in his book Defeat into Victory, regarded the long-range penetration operations of the Lushai Brigade to be the epitome of this sort of activity in warfare. They cleared the Japanese. It was a very, very hard operation. There are a number of regular battalions as part of this brigade, but the feelers and the vanguard of this brigade were members of V-Force, finding out where the Japanese were, walking into villages, gaining intelligence, coming back. Classic direct battlefield intelligence to conventional commanders to work out where they were going to send their forces as they cleared the valley. That's the Lushai Brigade, very important product of V-Force experience. The next was Operation Character. Operation Character was all the way down near Tungu. If you can see my cursor on the Satang River, on the edge of the Karen states. Quite an extraordinary series of operations in 1945, March and April 1945, that I'll just skim over very quickly because we're running out of time, but we've got time to explain it. The big challenge that General Slim had after the very successful battles of Maktila and Mandalay in February and March 1945 was how to get to Rangoon very quickly. He couldn't send his army there fast. It's the same distance as Paris to Marseille. It's a long, long way. He converted, he gave all the fuel in the 14th Army to his 4th Armored Corps, and he sent the 4th Armored Corps down to make its way down towards Rangoon, through the Satang Valley, cross Tungu, and then hopefully to be able to get to Rangoon before the rains came. Why was that important? Well, if he could punch his way down through central Burma, he would hopefully persuade the Japanese to give up the defense of Rangoon and to withdraw into the southeastern part of Burma, because the Japanese would then be cut off. So if he could force the Japanese out, that would be good, because it would mean that the planned amphibious invasion of Rangoon would be unopposed. So there was a huge strategic prize to getting the 4th Armored Corps down from Maktila through Tungu and capturing Tungu. The big issue was Tungu. How do you actually capture this and hold it against the Japanese? General Kimura, Japanese Area Army Commander, knew absolutely what Slim wanted to do and gave orders for all his available forces to move on Tungu and to hold Tungu. Tungu was the stop in the bottle. If Kimura could force the stop into the bottle, there was no way that Slim could get past. In a nutshell, the solution that Slim came to was to use Karen guerrillas, some 12 or 13,000 of them, and trained by British and Indian soldiers, many of whom had served in the Burmese Rifles before the war and had been part of the battles in 1942. And quite a number of them were experienced soldiers from V-Force. And these men came and landed by parachute and small plane in the Karen Hills. They trained the Karen fighters up, and the Karen fighters then took the war to the Japanese. It was tremendously successful. More Japanese soldiers were killed by Karen guerrillas trained by the men I've described than were killed by conventional forces in 1945. And it was an extraordinary testament to the success of long-range penetration, special operations, and of garnering the desperation of the Karen people to actually take the war to the Japanese, who they had been repressed by through 1942 and 1943. So quite extraordinary, another legacy of V-Force. And then finally, the Culloden Valley. The Culloden Valley, this roadless valley down the Arakan, you can see it here. So the ambition was that land forces would continue down the coastline. This was an area of some embarrassment to the British and the Indian Army in 1943. And 1944 had seen successful turning around of fortunes, and the offensive operations included the 81st and a part of the 82nd West African Division advancing down the Culloden Valley behind the Japanese at Akiab. So you can see a whole movement coming down through this otherwise impenetrable terrain to capture Akiab, now called Sittwe, from behind. This was also a very significant operation of war because the fantastic 81st West African Division, on aerial rations, so on air supply for 9 whole months, so threatened the Japanese at Akiab that the Japanese withdrew their forces from Arakan through into the Irrawaddy Valley, and the amphibious operations against Akiab were undertaken unopposed. All again because of the threatening operations of this fantastic long-range penetration division, supported and led at the front by members of V-Force. And there's a photograph of a V-Force team here in Arakan. So quite extraordinarily important strategically in 1945. Right, we're nearing the end. So it's time for some conclusions. Well, you can see General Bill Slim there, this wonderful photograph, original color photograph taken when he took the surrender of Mandalay, a big parade. And he says in his memoirs, I fully realized the magnificent and vital part V-Force played in our victory. Now, those words are actually quite important if you know of Slim's view of special forces. Slim did not regard special forces to be useful in their own right unless they were directly associated with conventional force operations that were designed to achieve a strategic objective. And I have to say, Slim was absolutely right. All the evidence from the Burma campaign is that where operations by special groups, which sucked a lot of oxygen out of operations, were not associated with achieving a military strategic aim, they were effectively wasteful of men and resources. Slim didn't regard V-Force to be such. He regarded them to be a very, very significant part of the overall picture of victory that he was responsible for designing and achieving in Burma in 1942 and 1944 and 1945. So in summary, V-Force in 1942 couldn't have stopped a Japanese invasion of India, but it stepped into the breach when nothing else existed. And what else one might say about Indians volunteering for service in a colonial enterprise, no one can doubt the alacrity with which the men of the hill tribes joined up. There was no problem with recruitment, and none of the reports that I've been through in the National Archives does anyone ever complain about recruitment. Anyone who knows anything about soldiering will realize it's the thing that people most complain about. It's, getting soldiers is a very, very hard task. Retaining them is even harder. But there was no problem with recruitment, even in the tough times of 1942 and 1943. We need to remember that V-Force was effectively a rudimentary defensive web of interlocking loyal villages. It was a way in which villages could come together with a sense that the government was supporting them, enabling them, aware of their concerns about the advancing Japanese, and promising to arm them and protect them. And it did so. And Charles Porzi is a fabulous example of the work that the government of India did in supporting the tribes in the face of the Japanese invasion. It demonstrated remarkable flexibility. Think about how it moved from being a watch and ward operation in 1942 to taking offensive action against the Japanese in 1945. That's really quite remarkable for any military organization. And it proved its value when attached, as I said, to regular formations. And I've made the point about being a nexus for loyalty to the government coalescing. I need to say that not all the villages were loyal to the government in 1942 and 43. Quite a number of the Kiki villages in the hills north of Manipur supported the Japanese, not a large number, but a significant number. And one needs to be reminded of what was known as the Kiki Rebellion in the 1920s that was put down by the Assam Rifles. So there was resistance to the government of India, but in the round, it was insignificant in 1942 to 44. There was a little bit of it, but not much. And I've made the point about the high quality rather of volunteers being at the heart of those great long-range penetration operations in Burma proper in 1945. Really quite an extraordinary set of operations. Right, and my last slide is simply to point you to some books on the subject. There are a number of very good books. I haven't got them all there. There were just a number that I managed to snap yesterday. The Naga Queen is there. Ursula Graham Bower's own book, Naga Path, distinctly I remember, is there. The Johnnies is there. The Raiders of Arakan by Lucas Phillips. Charles Chase and Harry Fessett's The Road to Kohima doesn't talk hugely about V-Force. That's the book that Harry Fessett's going to have to write next. But it does talk about the way in which the Naga communities came together and experienced the war. And a number of other books as well there, including a very large book that is coming out on Remembrance Day. So, it's just worth my while mentioning Richard Duckett's wonderful book, Special Operations Executive in Burma, published a couple of years ago. It's the first book, in my view, to really highlight the importance of SOE in Burma and the tremendous role that they played in bringing about victory in 1945, a forgotten subject, an unknown subject, in fact, until Richard produced this fabulous book. Right, I think I've done my hour, and it's time now to hand back to Sylvia. Thank you, Sylvia.
Well, I know that I speak for us all, that was probably your best one yet, Rob. That was a brilliant presentation and absolutely fascinating. There is a complete party going on of the 126 people that have been listening, and everybody is chatting amongst themselves. And it's been wonderful to hear. There's a lot of participation and a lot of interest and a lot of really good points that you're all making. There are about, at the moment, 14 questions, which we will turn our attention to. Do you want me to read them out, Rob, or will you click on the...
Go for them. Choose the ones that you think I'll be able to answer.
You can answer them all. From Chanda Sundaram, did V-Force ever encounter the INA?
Yes, the V-Force did encounter the INA. There are a number of recorded occasions when INA prisoners were taken. Very rare for the INA to offer battle. But yes, there are 3 or 4 occasions when I've seen that reports were of the INA surrendering to members of V-Force.
And from Robert Albright, hi Robert, thanks for joining us again. I've been following your chat, which Mel's been answering you. You've said that your father in 44 moved from V-Force into the Lushai brigade. Is that connected to Z-Force, you're asking?
Yes, okay, so Z-Force was another organization led by a chap called Peacock, and it was responsible for long-range patrols into Burma in 1944, and then it took offensive, had a more of an offensive role in support of SOE in 1945. Richard Duckett's book is very good on Peacock, and in fact, I don't have it with me, but Peacock, his own book is hard to find, but absolutely fabulous. But in 1945, the offensive elements of V-Force was largely in December 1944 was stood down, but elements of V-Force were then taken and lumped in with Z-Force, still called V-Force, and given to SOE. So it's organizationally, it's very hard to track what happens. But what became very evident was that there were some really superb soldiers in V-Force who could play a very significant role doing that sort of stuff in Burma in 1945, and they were readily recruited and played, as you now know, a very significant role in the 14th Army's operations.
And from Steve Snelling, evening Steve, having read and enjoyed Anthony Irwin's Burmese Outpost and Lucas Phillips' The Raiders of the Arakan, I thought tonight's overview of V-Force was excellent, as well as enlightening. Do you know of any other published works on the subject?
Yes, Henbury, who wrote a book, Spy Master in Malaya, there's at least one chapter in his book. I can send you, Steve, his details. In fact, I'm happy to put these up on the website afterwards. And that's very interesting. There isn't a huge amount more to the ones that I showed you. John Bowen's Undercover in the Jungle was fascinating. Fellows Gordon talks about the work of the Katian guerrillas, some of whom in early 1940, in 42 and early 43 were V-Force, but thereafter not. There's very little actually written on the subject, Steve.
And from Judy Salmon. Thanks, Judy. Lovely to have you join us tonight, and thanks for getting in touch. You're asking, to be an officer in V-Force, what type of character was required that was unique to V-Force rather than a more normal British Army regiment? My father, John Salmon, was to me very special, but I would love to know how he got into this outfit.
I think it was about, as I described it, military adventurers, and they're a good thing in organizations like this. They were men who didn't particularly, or a woman, as we see with Ursula Graham Bower, who, you know, perhaps wouldn't normally fit well into regimental life, but that's a little bit unfair. Many of them, of course, would have done as well, but they wanted a bit of excitement. I think the most important thing, though, is that they knew the hills, and they knew, or at least they had lots of experience of working in tribal areas, knew how villages worked, knew how insular they were, knew how concerned they were about their security, knew what was important. These men were also phenomenally fit. They walked everywhere. It was only in 44 that a number of them got jeeps, but you know, they weren't particularly good in the forward areas. But also men who were adept with languages and willing to get their hands dirty and become part of very, very small teams, of mixed teams of Assam Rifles, of tribesmen and themselves. And you know, V-Force gave these exceptional men an exceptional opportunity. I have to say also, when you read histories of conventional operations, you often come across stories of organizations failing in battle, or failing an organization, or, you know, commanding officers being sacked, you know, organizations not doing particularly well at particular times in battle. I need to ask Harry, but I haven't come across any stories of V-Force failing. There's one occasion when a V-Force post was overrun. Most of the V-Force men were kookies and gave up very quickly to the Japanese. But it's the only incident that I've come across. With that exception, V-Force stood firm, and that is a product of fabulous leadership, good organization. Well, actually, fabulous leadership at a local level. That's why men fight. They fight for their local teams and their local leaders, and they trusted them. And V-Force is a really good example of how that organization just held together under the stresses and strains of 1942 with the fear of the Japanese.
Thanks, Rob. And Darren Little, who's been very involved this evening, he's asking, did V-Force ever had dealings with SOE in Burma, especially in the Arakan and towards Rangoon?
Yes. SOE relied very much on V-Force in Arakan and in Operation Character, which I've described in around Tungu. SOE was the controlling organization, and they reached out to the army in India, the British Army and the Indian Army, and the forces that were available, to get troops who could do the task of training up the Karen levies. And V-Force, were called on by SOE to do that work, and did it very, very successfully.
And from Philip Woods, I don't know how many questions you want to do live, Rob, but there are lots.
Keep on going.
And from Philip Woods, the British seemed totally surprised to find Akyab unoccupied by the Japanese in January 1945 when they carried out the seaborne invasion. Wasn't Slim also critical of that lack of intelligence? I think you've answered, but he asked, did V-Force have any responsibility for this?
V-Force were entirely, let me say that it was the 81st West Africans that was entirely responsible for forcing Sakurai out of Akyab. There's no doubt about that. But then when you go and look at the 81st West African, who was actually doing all the forward patrolling and intelligence gathering and helping the 81st West Africans in their fabulous march down that valley, it was V-Force. V-Force had people in Akyab itself, really quite an extraordinary story. And I agree with Slim, and I agree with Scoons earlier and Manpower and Douglas Gracie that forward battlefield intelligence was poor on the whole. But I would say that that's really up to the Corps. The Corps itself should be responsible for gathering its battlefield intelligence. That's intelligence out to the next 10, 12, or 15 miles. V-Force did stuff beyond that. But there is actually a problem in communication here, because V-Force intelligence wasn't going back to the division or the Corps it was going back to a command that was sending it back to 14th Army. So information and intelligence often found its way to the front line in a tortuous way. Yes, so there should have been, in my view, it would have made more sense to have direct links between V-Force and the forward divisions and corps. Then again, you don't want to give them too many tasks and too many taskmasters, because their operations then become confused. As it was, V-Force grew over time into something that it was never intended to be, but actually did that very successfully.
And from Roy Seaman, I know he's part of a big group here tonight. He's asking, how did V-Force's intelligence make its way to the larger formations, such as in the Kabul Valley operations? Did they have radio contact, or did they make physical contact with divisions?
Both. Physical networks and radios as well. There are only 7 radios in 1942, but by 1944, radios were absolutely indispensable. And communication, everything was done by radio. But as I said earlier, the problem was that Kabul Valley was different. Information did go back directly to 81st West African, 82nd West African rather, but the in Manpower it didn't. Went back to Shillong first, and then found its way back to 4 Corps, which was a little bit roundabout.
Thank you. And from Nick Short, were the Japanese at all able to secure the support of any local people, or were they either supportive of the British or studiously neutral?
It's a great question, Nick. Thank you very much indeed. They received a little bit of support at the start from some of the Kuki villages, and right at the beginning of their operations in Manipur and Assam, well, in Assam in particular, so into the Naga Hills in early April into May, they blistered themselves onto Naga villages, and the general story is told very well in Charles Chasey and Harry Fessett's The Road to Kohima. They began by presenting themselves as saviors of the Naga people from colonial oppression. Very, very quickly, that relationship went sour. By the time that the Japanese were ejected from late June onwards, the Nagas, virtually to a village, were hounding them out and looking forward to them going. Many villagers just ran into the jungle and survived in the jungle or not. It's a very difficult situation for many of them. This is where Charles Porzi came into his own again by corralling the Naga refugees together, feeding them, looking after them and protecting them, but from Japanese depredation. The Japanese were starving by this time. By June, they were starving, and they were taking everything they could from the Naga villages.
And then Richard Cullen, evening Richard, his father was seconded to Area 2 in 1943, and he has a couple of questions which may be better written afterwards, but I know how busy Rob is. Richard is asking, my searches for V-Force info at Q have turned up very little, mainly 44 and 45 politics. Where should he look?
There is no other place, I'm afraid. I am hoping to, with the help of Rana China from USI and Delhi, look at the Indian archives next year. Katrina Child might have some more information. I don't know whether she does, but I think the only other place where information might be, which I haven't yet looked, is the Indian Office archives in the British Library.
Okay, thank you. And he's also asking you anything about the structure of V-Force units, particularly the level of the Indian Army support. I feel you may have covered that, but
yes, I mean, so the army in India, in the hills, was one army. It became, the primary support came from the Assam Rifles. So logistical support, if it wasn't provided directly through V-Force itself, came from the Assam Rifles. And where it was necessary to gain support from the conventional formations, so 4 Corps and Manipur, they did so directly through V-Force. V-Force command went to 4 Corps and said, we need a Jeep, or we need X, Y, and Z. And 4 Corps certainly supplied and sustained all the forward bases, the V-Force bases along the Chinwan. They provided them with rations. There was a 100-mile journey back from one of them. And supplies were brought up by 4 Corps, left in a dump, and there's a constant toing and froing from the forward base to the supply dump for food and equipment.
And an interesting one from Ross Cable. Thank you, Ross. How well does this theatre lend itself to profitably visiting the ground to study it? I ask in terms of a potential staff ride for the Australian Army. Is it necessary to enter Burma, and would that perhaps complicate such a visit?
You don't need to go to Burma. Wouldn't it be marvellous if you were able to do that? I'm rather hoping that Burma will open up again next year. Your best bet is actually to go to Kohima and mount a staff ride from Kohima. Get in touch with us, and we can give you some assistance. We certainly know the ground and can provide you with help and ideas. Kohima is a fabulous place for a staff ride, as indeed is Imphal. And I'll be leading a couple of groups there next year. Nick Short will be holding me to that. I've been promising Nick that for a long time.
And then 3 kind of related questions from different people. Andrew Perry asks, did V-Force ever work with observation squadrons of 303 Brigade and D-Force? And Darren Little's asking if they ever had dealings with SOE in Burma. And John Hinchcliffe, was there contact with OSS in the north? Yes
to all those questions. I mean, there was no operational divides between units on the ground in reality. And V-Force was a very flexible organization, and it blistered itself very comfortably with NCAC in the north, 303, line of communication, and so on. I mean, it was horses for courses, actually. It was a remarkable organization. It did what was necessary where it was.
Great, and I think one last one from Caroline Alexander, and she wonders if you knew the self-published book KC8 Burma by Bob Phillips. The author was part of a small US team sent into the Naga Hills to establish air raid warning systems in '42 under the direction of V-Force leaders.
What was the name of the book?
KC8 Burma. I'll send this to you later on, Rob.
I haven't heard of the book, but my friend Vince Olivero, in fact, Vince died a couple of years ago, but we had a long correspondence. I had hoped one day, a long time ago, to write a book about the work of the United States Army Air Force in the Naga Hills. This all came out of research among the headhunters and the story of Panksha, which many of you will know about. And Vince sent me all those photographs, and there were quite a number of those organizations in the hills, and KC8 Burma, I'll look forward to getting hold of a copy, seems to be a description of those operations.
Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for. There are 1 or 2 unanswered ones, my apologies, but we will come back to you in writing, as they say. But we so much appreciate your participation. And I want to say how grateful KET are to Rob Lyman for all the time he has given us. I know how many of you have enjoyed the online events, and I'm sure are watching him on all the series of other events that he does. I know his diary is as full as anyone's, and the fact that he gives his time to us is an immeasurable gift. Thank you. And thank everyone out there for all your continuing support. As you know, Kohima Educational Trust is a charity. We are in the process of preparing our annual newsletter, which you will be receiving at the end of November. And I hope you can take a moment to check out the KET store on our website, where many of the books mentioned are available for sale, along with Naga Christmas cards made in Naga homes. And more imminently, we also have some especially commissioned Kohima poppy pins ready for Remembrance Sunday. This will be the last webinar for this year from KET, but we will be back in touch with next year's programme very soon, when we look forward to welcoming you all once again. Thank you and goodbye for now.